Hello and welcome to Edexcel 1 to 9 History GCSE Revision. We're going to be looking at Paper 3, Weimar and Nazi Germany, 1918 to 1939. The front of your paper will always look like this. Inside you will have an inference question where you look at one source and provide two inferences. You have a 12 marker where you want to be looking at writing 2 to 3 paragraphs. A utility question where you analyse the usefulness of two sources. You then compare two interpretations, how they differ, first of all, why they differ, and then lastly, which one you agree with more for 20 marks. It's a good idea if you start in the middle of your exam. Now this might sound strange, however question 3A, 3B, 3C and 3D are all linked. They're all on the same topic and combined there were 36 marks in total. That's more than 2/3 of your overall paper. So if I was you, I'd start with your source question. Study sources B and C. How useful are they for an inquiry into explaining the downfall of the Weimar Republic? This is worth 8 marks. So you want to be writing roughly 2 paragraphs. Looking at the mark scheme, you are judged on 3 different criteria. First of all, the red highlighted areas are your ability to analyse the usefulness of the source. This is looking at the nature, the origin and the purpose. The blue area is your interaction with the source. So can you paraphrase or can you describe the source and link it back to the inquiry? And the green section is your contextual knowledge. What all knowledge do you have about the particular inquiry? And does this make your source useful? To make your examiner's job easier, you should lay your paragraph out in this type of structure. Source analysis, usefulness, any limitations or any reasons why the source is not useful, and then finally your context. So first of all, we're going to analyse our source. This means you need to pick out relevant details in the source and try and link them back to the inquiry by explaining this quote or this description in your own words. Try to make sure that you're picking details that are relevant to the specific inquiry. In this case, we're looking for reasons why the Weimar Republic collapsed or reasons that explain the downfall of the Weimar Republic in 1932 and 1933. For source B, we've chosen this quote. When he spoke, it was a rhetorical masterpiece. In a few sentences, he transformed the mood of the audience. I have rarely experienced anything like it. This is quite useful because it explains how Hitler's public speaking was one of the party's greatest strengths, and this does later contribute to the fall of the Weimar Republic. Source C, on the other hand, gives us a different reason why the Weimar fell. An almost unbroken chain of homeless men extends the whole length of the Great Hamburg-Berlin Highway. It is the same scene for the entire 200 miles and all of the highways in Germany which I passed through this year. This makes the source quite useful because it explains the level of economic poverty that was taking place in Germany at the time, which is one of the reasons why the Weimar eventually collapses. Even the titles of the sources are really useful in terms of their provenance. They normally give you an idea of what nature, in terms of what type of source it is, where it's come from, and from these two things you can kind of work out its purpose or why it was made. Source B is a witness testimony at Hitler's trial following the Munich Putsch in 1923. So normally witnesses have to tell the truth, they have to be accurate, otherwise the person they're giving evidence against does not get a fair trial. However, you could also argue that the origin of this source, i.e. a witness testimony from 1923, isn't particularly useful for an event that takes place in 1933. If, however, you look at source C, the dates are much closer. This is a German journalist talking in 1932, roughly around the same time that the Weimar collapses. Yes, journalists have the permission to exaggerate in order to entertain their reader, but it's still more useful. We now need to look at some of our own knowledge. So for example, if you look at the piece of information highlighted in green, source B is about the Munich Putsch and it comes from 1923. We know that in a way the Munich Putsch contributed to the collapse of the Weimar Republic as it gave Hitler a platform to criticise the Social Democrats, to criticise Stresemann and to criticise the Weimar government. However, this is 10 years before the actual collapse, so this doesn't make our source useful. In comparison, source C comes from 1932. Now, from our own knowledge, we know that there was a lot of economic problems in 1932. There was over 5 million people unemployed. There were 60% of graduates were unable to get a job. And this is one of the reasons why people eventually start voting for extremist parties, because they want change. So our own knowledge makes this source quite useful. In source B, it says, when he spoke, it was a rhetorical masterpiece. I have rarely experienced anything like it. This is useful for an inquiry into the downfall of the Weimar Republic, as it suggests that Germans were often mesmerised by Hitler and his public speaking. This is a witness testimony at the Munich Putsch, which is useful, as the evidence being given had to be accurate and truthful in order for Hitler to receive a fair trial. However, a limitation of the source could be that this testimony was delivered in 1923, which is nearly 10 years before the fall of the Weimar. Even though Hitler's public speaking was one of his strengths, in the years after 1923, the Nazis got very few votes. Therefore, this source is useful for understanding Hitler's role in the fall of the Weimar. However, this particular source is too early to explain why the Weimar collapsed in 1932. Returning back to our mark scheme, if we look at the blue section first, the sources are analysed to support reasoning about their utility. So we've ticked that box there by using a direct quote, and then we've explained our quote in reference to the actual question. Why did the Weimar Republic fail in 1932? So we've ticked that box. Judgments on source utility for the specified inquiry are given, applying valid criteria with developed reasoning which takes into account the provenance and how it affects the usefulness of the source content. So we've talked about its nature, the fact that it's a witness testimony. We've talked about its origin, the fact that it comes from 1923. And we've talked about its purpose, the idea that it is given in evidence and that has to be truthful. So we've ticked that box as well. So 2 out of 3 so far. And we've also ticked the last box as well. Contextual knowledge is used in the process of interpreting the sources and applying criteria for the judgments on their utility. So we've talked about strength of public speaking. We've talked about Nazis getting very few votes. We've talked about the role of Hitler being important for the fall of the Weimar. Even the analysis at the end of the source about it being 10 years before the fall of the Weimar Republic is still technically old knowledge. So we've wrote one paragraph there, and we should be getting... To make sure that you get 6, 7 or 8, it would be a really good idea to make sure you follow that same structure for the second source. It would be a good idea that you pause the video now, had a quick read through this source, and tried those 3 steps for yourself. Use a quote, explain that quote, step 1. Talk about the provenance of the source, Heinrich Hauser, the German journalist, in 1932 and why that's useful. Then provide some own knowledge. Best of luck.